The sound of the machines was the only thing keeping me grounded. A steady rhythm, mechanical, indifferent, unlike me. I sat beside the hospital bed, my fingers wrapped tightly around Daniel's hand. His skin felt colder than it should have. I kept rubbing it gently, as if I could bring warmth back just by refusing to let go. 43 years together, and it all came down to this quiet room that smelled like antiseptic and endings. "I'm here," I whispered, leaning closer. "I'm not going anywhere." His breathing was shallow now. Every inhale felt like a struggle. Every exhale like it might be the last. He turned his head slightly toward me. His eyes, tired, but still so full of the same softness I had fallen in love with, met mine. "Isabella," he murmured. I swallowed hard. "Yes. I'm here." "Listen to me," he said, barely audible. "No." I shook my head quickly. "You don't need to talk. Save your strength." But he tightened his fingers around mine with surprising force. "I need to." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. "Take care of yourself," he said. "Promise me." Tears blurred my vision instantly. "Don't say that. You're going to be fine. We'll go home soon, remember? You still owe me that trip." He gave the faintest smile. "You always pretend everything will be okay." "I have to," I whispered. "For both of us." His gaze softened even more. "I love you, Isabella." My heart cracked open. "I love you too," I said, my voice breaking. "Always." The machine behind him let out a long, continuous tone. Flat, endless, final. I froze. For a moment, I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't even think. Because if I didn't react, maybe it wasn't real. Doctors rushed in. Nurses spoke quickly. Hands moved. Voices overlapped. But none of it reached me. Because I already knew. He was gone. Just like that. After everything we had been through, he was gone. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes. Hours. Time didn't exist anymore. Until the door slammed open. What happened? The voice hit me like a slap. I turned slowly. Ethan. My son. But the look on his face wasn't grief. It was anger. "What did you do?" he demanded, stepping into the room. I blinked, confused. "Ethan, your father." "I got a call 20 minutes ago," he cut in sharply. 20 minutes, Mom. "And you didn't even think to call me sooner?" "I called you yesterday," I said quietly. "You said you were busy." "That's not the point." His voice rose, sharp enough to make one of the nurses glance over. "You always mess things up," he continued. "You probably didn't even give them the right number." The words hit harder than I expected. I had just lost my husband, and my son was blaming me. "Ethan, please," I whispered. "Not now." "You're right," he said coldly. "Not now. Because now I have to fix everything." Fix. As if this was some kind of inconvenience. He walked past me and stood beside the bed, barely sparing his father a glance. "I'll handle the arrangements," he said. "Properly." My chest tightened. He's my husband. I should. "No." The word was firm. Absolute. "You'll just make it emotional and messy, like you always do." I stared at him. This boy. This man. The same child I carried, raised, protected. When did he become someone I didn't recognize? "I just want a little more time with him," I said softly. Ethan stepped between me and the bed. "The funeral home will be here soon," he said. "And I don't want you causing a scene." A scene. That's what my grief was to him. A problem. His wife, Claire, appeared quietly in the doorway. She had that same composed expression she always wore, polite, distant, calculated. "Isabella," she said, her tone smooth but empty. "You look exhausted. You should go home." I looked at her, then at Ethan, then at Daniel. "No,
y whispered.
I want to stay. Ethan shook his head. You've done enough. Done enough?
I felt something inside me shrink.
You can go home, he continued. Claire will drive you. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because suddenly I felt small, unwelcome, unimportant, like I no longer belonged in my own life. As Claire gently took my arm, I turned one last time toward the bed. Ethan was already on his phone,
Talking.
organizing, taking control, as if Daniel had been a task, not a person. The elevator doors closed in front of me, and in the reflection, I barely recognized myself. But deep inside, very deep, something stirred. A quiet voice, faint but steady. This isn't over. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's what Ethan had made very clear. And yet there I was, sitting in my car across from the funeral home, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, staring at the building where my husband lay inside, while I remained outside like a stranger who had taken a wrong turn. The parking lot was nearly full. Cars lined up in neat rows, people stepping out dressed in black, their faces composed in that familiar expression of polite sadness. Some carried flowers, others held cards. They all walked toward the entrance with quiet purpose, ready to say goodbye to a man who had meant something to them.
To them. And I was his wife.
43 years. And I wasn't allowed in. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. Maybe I should just leave, I whispered to myself. But my hands didn't move, because leaving would mean accepting it. Accepting that my son had decided I didn't belong at my own husband's farewell. Through the large windows I could see movement inside. Soft lighting, shadows passing, people gathering in small groups. And near the entrance there he was, Ethan.
Perfectly dressed.
Perfectly composed. Playing the role. He shook hands, nodded at condolences, placed a comforting hand on shoulders like he had rehearsed every gesture in front of a mirror. Claire stood beside him, elegant and still, her hand resting lightly on his arm like she was part of the performance. Anyone watching would think he was the devoted son. No one would see what I saw. The distance, the calculation, the control. A couple approached them, old friends of Daniel's, people I had shared dinners with for years. I watched as the woman hugged Ethan, clearly emotional. He leaned in slightly, said something soft, something appropriate. I could almost hear it. He was a great man. He was proud of you. Of course he was. Daniel had always believed the best about Ethan. Even when Ethan stopped visiting. Even when he always had an excuse. Work, meetings, deadlines. I was the one who sat through the treatments. I was the one who held Daniel when the pain became unbearable. I was the one who stayed. But now none of that seemed to matter. A sudden knock on my window made me jump. I turned quickly and saw a familiar face. Isabella. It was Linda, my neighbor. Her eyebrows pulled together in concern as she leaned slightly toward the glass. I lowered the window, forcing a small smile. What are you doing out here? She asked immediately. The service is starting soon. My chest tightened. I searched for something to say, something that didn't sound as humiliating as the truth. I just needed some air. Linda glanced toward the building, then back at me. Shouldn't you be inside? There it was. The question I couldn't answer. Ethan is handling everything, I said carefully. He thought it would be better if what? She pressed. I looked down at my hands. He thinks I get too emotional. Silence. I could feel her staring at me. Then she let out a short, incredulous breath. That's ridiculous, she said. You're his wife. You belong there more than anyone. I nodded slightly. I know, but knowing didn't change anything. Linda looked like she wanted to argue more, but another car pulled up behind her, forcing her to step aside. "I'm calling you tomorrow," she said firmly. "This isn't right." I gave a small nod. As she walked away, I saw her pause near the entrance, speaking to someone and then, unmistakably, pointing back toward my car. Heat rushed to my face. Now people would know. They would see me sitting here, like someone unwanted, like someone excluded. The minutes dragged on painfully. Each new arrival felt like another reminder of where I wasn't. I watched as people entered. I watched as people left. I watched as life continued without me. At one point, a teenage boy stepped out of a car with his parents. He looked uncomfortable, unsure how to carry himself in a place like this. I recognized him. Daniel had taken him fishing last summer, teaching him patiently, laughing when he tangled the line. Daniel would have wanted me to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him stories. But I stayed in my seat, frozen, because I had been told, without being told, that I wasn't welcome. Then something caught my attention. Near the guest table inside, Claire stood with a pen, writing something down. Names. Addresses. She was keeping track. Ethan leaned closer to her, whispering something. They both glanced toward the parking lot.
Toward me.
Claire smiled. Not kindly, not warmly. It was a small, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. And suddenly, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about me being too emotional. This was intentional, deliberate. They wanted me to feel this, to understand my place. The realization settled heavily in my chest. A new car pulled into the lot. I barely paid attention at first until I saw who stepped out. A woman in a dark coat, carrying a structured leather bag, moving with quiet confidence. I recognized her immediately. Margaret, Daniel's lawyer. What was she doing here? I watched as she approached the entrance. Ethan greeted her with the same practiced expression, but I could see the tension in his posture from even this distance. They spoke briefly. Claire hovered beside him, alert, observant. Then Margaret turned and looked directly at me. Our eyes met across the parking lot. She raised her hand slightly. A small, deliberate gesture. Acknowledgement. Ethan followed her gaze. His head turned sharply toward my car. Even from here, I could see his jaw tighten. He said something to Margaret, quick, firm. She responded calmly. And then, she walked away from him, straight toward me. My heart started pounding. I didn't understand why, but something about it felt important. Different. Like the first crack in something that had seemed solid and unchangeable. She reached my car and tapped gently on the window. I quickly wiped my eyes and rolled it down. "Isabella," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely steady. She glanced briefly back toward the funeral home. "May I sit with you for a moment?" I hesitated only for a second before unlocking the door. She slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her a sense of calm I hadn't felt in days. "I won't take much of your time," she said, "but I needed to speak with you." "With me?" I asked, surprised. She nodded. "Daniel asked me to." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "There are some matters we need to discuss. Important ones, but not here." My mind immediately jumped to the worst. Is something wrong? Financially? The house. Her expression softened.
No.
Not wrong. A pause. Just not what you've been led to believe. Before I could ask anything else, a sharp knock hit the window. I turned. Ethan, standing right beside the car. His expression tight, controlled. Margaret calmly lowered her window. "I was just offering my condolences," she said before he could speak. "You've done that," Ethan replied curtly. "My mother should be resting." "I'm sure Isabella can decide that for herself," Margaret said evenly. The tension between them was immediate,
palpable.
Ethan's eyes flicked toward me. What did she want? He asked. Nothing, I said quickly. Just to say hello. He studied me for a moment, clearly not convinced. But then he straightened. Go home, he said. This isn't the place for you. The words should have hurt more. But somehow they didn't. Not the same way. Because now, something had changed. Margaret placed a gentle hand over mine. I'll call you tomorrow, she said quietly. Please answer. I nodded. She stepped out of the car and walked away without another word. Ethan lingered for a second longer, watching me. Then he turned and returned to the building. I sat there in silence. The same parking lot, the same cold air, the same loneliness. But it didn't feel the same anymore, because now I knew something they didn't. And for the first time since Daniel died, I wasn't just grieving. I was waiting. The house felt wrong without him. Not just empty, wrong. Like something essential had been removed, leaving behind a shell that still looked like home, but no longer felt like it. I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me, and for a moment I just stood there listening. No television.
No footsteps.
No quiet humming from the kitchen like Daniel used to do when he thought no one was paying attention. Just silence. My eyes moved across the room automatically, landing on the small, ordinary things that suddenly carried unbearable weight. His mug was still on the counter, the one with the chipped handle I'd told him to throw away a dozen times. His glasses rested on the arm of his chair. A book lay open, face down, as if he'd be back any minute to finish the page. But he wouldn't. I walked over and picked up the glasses, holding them carefully in both hands before pressing them gently against my chest. My breath hitched, and for a second, I thought I might collapse right there in the middle of the living room. But I didn't, because something else was there too. Not just grief. Something quieter. Something steady. The memory of Margaret's voice. Not what you've been led to believe. Before I could fully process that thought, my phone rang.
The sound startled me.
I glanced at the screen.
Claire.
I hesitated, but answered. Hello. Isabella. Her voice came, smooth and controlled as always. Ethan and I are coming over. My stomach tightened immediately. Tonight?
I asked.
I'm really not. We won't be long, she interrupted. There are practical matters we need to discuss. Practical? Of course. Claire, We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. No question.
No consideración. Just a decision made for me.
Again. I looked down at myself, still dressed in black, still carrying the weight of a day I hadn't even been allowed to fully experience, and let out a quiet breath. 20 minutes. That's all the time I had before they walked in and started rearranging my life. I didn't move much during those minutes. I didn't clean. I didn't change. I simply sat in Daniel's chair, staring ahead, trying to gather my thoughts, but they refused to settle. When the doorbell rang, sharp and impatient, I felt my shoulders tense. Come in, I called, not bothering to stand. They entered like they owned the place. Ethan first, then Claire behind him, already holding a folder, her posture straight, her expression focused. They didn't look like people who had just buried someone. They looked like people arriving for a meeting. Sit down, Mom, Ethan said, gesturing toward the couch.
Mom.
Not Isabella. Not even gently. Just functional. Claire moved immediately to the coffee table, opening her folder and laying out papers with precise movements. We've been going over everything, she began, and we think we've found the best solution. Solution. I felt that word sink into me like a stone. For what? I asked quietly. Ethan sat down, in Daniel's chair. The sight of it made something twist inside me. For your living situation, he said. I stared at him. My living situation? Claire nodded slightly, as if explaining something obvious. This house is too much for you now, she said. Too large, too expensive, too much upkeep. My eyes moved slowly around the room. Too much? This was my home. Every wall held a memory. Every corner had a story. I'm not leaving, I said. Ethan sighed, leaning forward. Mom, be realistic. I am. No, you're being emotional. There it was again. That word. Use like a weapon. I can manage my own home, I said, my voice steady but quieter than I wanted it to be. With what? He shot back. Do you even know how much things cost? I blinked. What are you talking about? Claire exchanged a quick glance with him before stepping in. The medical expenses, she said. The treatments. The private care. Insurance didn't cover everything. My stomach dropped. What expenses? Ethan frowned slightly, as if surprised I didn't already know. Dad didn't tell you? I shook my head slowly. He handled the finances. Well, Claire continued, her tone calm but almost rehearsed, it's worse than you think. Most of the savings are gone.
Gone.
The word echoed in my mind. That's not possible, I whispered. We were careful. Daniel always. Things changed, Ethan cut in. You just didn't see it. I felt disoriented, like the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. How much? I asked. It doesn't matter, he said quickly. The point is, you can't stay here. Claire slid one of the papers toward me. We found a place, she said. It's very nice. Safe.
Clean.
They have activities, medical staff, everything you might need. I looked down at the brochure. Smiling elderly people. Bright rooms. Organized schedules.
Assisted living.
The words blurred slightly as my eyes moved across the page.
I don't need this, I said.
Not now, Claire replied smoothly. But soon. I'm not helpless. No one said you were, Ethan said, though his tone suggested otherwise. It sounds like you did. Silence. A brief, uncomfortable silence. Then Ethan leaned back, his expression tightening. We're trying to help you, he said. By deciding my life for me? By making sure you don't ruin it. That one landed. Hard. I stared at him. At my son. And for a moment, I didn't recognize him at all. I need time, I said finally. Claire nodded, already gathering the papers. Of course, but not too long. There's a waiting list. A waiting list. As if my life had already been scheduled. They stood to leave.
No hug. No softness.
Just efficiency. At the door, Ethan paused. You'll thank us later, he said. Then they were gone. The silence returned. But now it felt heavier. More oppressive. I sat there for a long time, staring at the brochure in my hands. Something didn't add up. If the money was gone, how could this place be an option? It was expensive. I could see that clearly. Unless the plan wasn't for them to pay. Unless the plan was for me to pay. With the house. The thought made my chest tighten. I stood up slowly and walked to the table, picking up the brochure again, flipping through it more carefully this time. Numbers.
Fees.
Contracts. And suddenly, Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. Don't sign anything. I froze. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just concern. This wasn't just help. This was something else. Something calculated. Something planned. I slowly set the papers down, then walked back to Daniel's chair.
Sat down.
And reached for my purse. The envelope was still there. Untouched. Waiting. My hands trembled slightly as I took it out. My name was written on the front. In his handwriting. For Isabella. I traced the letters gently with my finger. A part of me was afraid to open it. because whatever was inside would change everything. I took a deep breath, slid my finger under the flap, and opened it. Inside were several pages. I unfolded the first one carefully. My dearest Isabella, my vision blurred instantly. I blinked, forcing myself to keep reading. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. My chest tightened. But I need you to understand something. You are stronger than you think. Stronger than anyone has ever given you credit for. A tear slid down my cheek. I've seen how you've been treated. I've seen how your voice has been ignored. And I regret not stepping in sooner. My heart pounded. He knew. He had seen it. Everything. I've made arrangements to protect you. To make sure no one can take away your home, your independence, or your dignity. I sat up straighter. My breathing shallow now. Trust Margaret. She will explain everything. Everything. I turned the page, my hands shaking. It's time for you to stop letting others decide who you are. Another tear fell. It's time for you to become the woman I've always known you to be. I lowered the paper slowly. The room felt different. The air felt different. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I wasn't just someone being pushed aside. I wasn't helpless. Daniel had known it. He had believed it. And now, for the first time, I started to believe it too. I looked at the envelope in my hands, then toward the door Ethan had walked out of, and a quiet realization settled deep inside me. They thought I was weak. They thought I would follow. They thought they were in control. But they were wrong, because whatever Daniel had done, whatever he had prepared, was about to change everything. And this time, I wouldn't stay silent. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Daniel's letter resting on my chest, reading it over and over again, as if the words might change if I looked long enough. But they didn't. If anything, they became clearer, sharper, stronger. He had seen everything. Every moment I had been dismissed. Every time Ethan spoke over me. Every time I doubted myself and chose silence instead of conflict. Daniel had seen it all, and he hadn't ignored it. He had done something about it. That thought stayed with me until morning. By the time the sunlight crept through the curtains, I wasn't the same woman who had sat in that parking lot the night before. I was still grieving, still aching, but underneath that, something else had taken root. Awareness. And something close to resolve. At exactly 1:47 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot outside Margaret's office. I noticed how steady my hands were on the steering wheel this time.
No trembling. No hesitation.
Just a quiet determination. The building itself didn't look intimidating. It wasn't one of those towering glass structures that made you feel small just by standing near it. It was modest, professional, almost welcoming. Still, as I stepped out of the car, I felt a familiar flicker of doubt. What if this was all a misunderstanding? What if Ethan was right? What if I really couldn't handle any of this? I closed the car door and stood still for a moment. Then I remembered Daniel's words. You are stronger than you think. And I walked inside. Margaret greeted me personally, not from behind a desk, but standing, as if she had been waiting. Isabella, she said warmly. I'm glad you came. Thank you for seeing me, I replied. She led me into her office, the same calm space I had briefly glimpsed in my imagination the night before. Books lined the shelves, but there were also photographs. Family, life, warmth. It didn't feel cold or distant. It felt human. Would you like some tea? She asked. I nodded. The small gesture grounded me. When we sat down, she didn't rush. She didn't open a file immediately. She simply looked at me, as if giving me space to arrive, not just physically, but mentally. I read his letter. I said, finally. Margaret gave a small, understanding nod. Then you already know he was preparing you. For what? I asked quietly. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder. For this. My heart began to beat faster. She placed the folder in front of me, but kept her hand on it for a moment, as if emphasizing the importance of what was inside. Before we go through this, she said, I need to ask you something. Has Ethan spoken to you about finances? I hesitated. Yes. And he said the money is mostly gone. Medical bills, treatments, that I can't afford to stay in the house. Margaret's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in her eyes sharpened. I see, she said calmly. That was all. But somehow, it said everything. That's not true, is it? I asked. She removed her hand from the folder. No, Isabella. It's not. The words landed quietly, but their impact was anything but. I leaned back slightly, trying to process it. Then why would he say that? Margaret opened the folder. That's something we'll come back to. She pulled out the first document. This, she said, is the will Ethan believes is valid. She handed it to me. I recognized the format immediately. We had signed something similar years ago. It was straightforward, logical, fair. Everything divided between Daniel and me, and eventually passing to Ethan. Yes, I said. This looks familiar. Margaret nodded. Now, she said, reaching for another document, this is the will Daniel actually filed 3 months ago. She placed it in front of me. I stared at it. Something about it already felt different. New. Final. My hands felt slightly colder as I picked it up. Take your time, Margaret said softly. I began reading. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases stood out almost immediately. Primary beneficiary. Full transfer of assets. Residential ownership granted without limitation. I frowned slightly. I don't understand. Margaret leaned forward slightly. It means everything was left to you. I looked up. What? The house, the accounts, the investments, the insurance. Everything. The room seemed to tilt slightly. But Ethan receives a fixed amount, she continued calmly. $5,000. Silence filled the space between us. Then back at the document. Then back at her again. That can't be right. It is. But why would Daniel do that? Margaret's voice remained steady. Because he saw what was happening. My throat tightened. He told you? I asked. He showed me, she replied. He documented specific incidents, conversations, decisions that were made without you, times when your voice was dismissed or ignored. My chest felt heavy. He didn't want conflict, I whispered. No, Margaret agreed. But he also didn't want you to be left unprotected. I lowered my gaze to the papers. Every word now felt heavier, more intentional. There's more, she said. I looked up again. What else? Margaret pulled out another page. Your husband included a clause. A pause. If Ethan attempts to contest the will, he forfeits everything. My breath caught. Everything. Even the 5,000. I sat back slowly. He thought of that too. Yes. I pressed my fingers lightly against my temple. This wasn't just planning. This was precision, protection, love expressed in the only way Daniel knew how at the end. But why wait? I asked. Why not tell me directly? Margaret closed the folder gently. Because he wanted to see what Ethan would do. I froze. What do you mean? He instructed me to observe, to give things time after his passing, to see how you would be treated without his presence. A chill ran through me, and Margaret held my gaze. I received a call yesterday. My stomach tightened. From Linda, your neighbor. Of course. She told me about the funeral home, about you sitting outside. I closed my eyes briefly. And about last night, Margaret continued. The pressure to move, the claims about finances, the assisted living arrangement. I opened my eyes again. So he was right, I said quietly. Margaret didn't soften it. Yes. The truth didn't explode. It settled. Heavy. Final.
Clear.
I let out a slow breath. What happens now? Margaret straightened slightly. Now we schedule the official reading of the will. When? Tomorrow morning. My heart skipped. So soon?
Yes.
Ethan believes he's about to inherit everything. It's best not to let assumptions grow any further. I nodded slowly. And after that? Margaret's expression softened again. After that, Isabella, you decide your life. The simplicity of that sentence almost overwhelmed me. My life. Not managed. Not directed. Not controlled.
Minne.
I looked down at my hands. They didn't feel as fragile anymore. They won't like this, I said.
No, Margaret replied honestly.
They won't. A small pause. But this was never about what they like. I nodded, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of that. As I stood to leave, Margaret walked me to the door. Isabella, she said gently. I turned. Yes, your husband trusted you. I felt something shift in my chest. He knew exactly what he was doing. I held her gaze. And now, she added, it's your turn. Outside, the air felt different. Clearer. Lighter. I walked to my car slowly, but not because I was unsure. Because I was thinking about everything that had changed. About everything that was about to change. Ethan believed he was in control. Claire believed they had already won. But tomorrow, everything would be exposed. And this time, I wouldn't sit in the parking lot. The next morning felt strangely calm. Not peaceful, but steady. Like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Not chaotic, but charged with something inevitable. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting the collar of my blouse, smoothing down fabric that didn't need smoothing. It wasn't about appearance. It was about control. For the first time in days, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. By the time I arrived at Margaret's office, Ethan and Claire were already there. Of course they were. They sat side by side at the long conference table, both dressed in dark, formal clothing, looking exactly how people look when they expect to inherit something significant. Prepared. Confident.
Certain.
Ethan glanced up as I entered. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, but it disappeared quickly. Mom, he said, standing halfway, as if unsure whether to greet me or remain seated. I'm fine, I said simply, taking a chair across from them. Claire gave me a small, polite smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. I'm glad you could make it, she said. Could make it, as if I were a guest. Margaret entered a moment later, carrying a folder. The same one. Everything in my chest tightened slightly, but I didn't let it show. Thank you all for coming, she said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Her tone was calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else now. Something firm. This is the formal reading of Daniel's last will and testament. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. Claire had a pen ready, already positioned above a notepad. They were ready to write things down, to calculate, to plan. Margaret opened the folder. Before we begin, she said, you should know that this document was executed 3 months ago, replacing any previous versions. Ethan frowned slightly. 3 months, he repeated. That doesn't make sense. His will was already finalized years ago. People update their wills, Margaret replied evenly, especially when circumstances change. Claire glanced at Ethan briefly, then back at Margaret. Of course, she said smoothly. Please continue. Margaret began reading. The opening language was formal, almost distant, legal phrases that seemed to fill the room without meaning much. I noticed Ethan shifting slightly, his attention sharpening as he waited for the part that mattered. The part he thought he already knew. Then Margaret reached it. To my beloved wife, Isabella. Something in my chest tightened. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all real property, financial accounts, investments, insurance policies, and personal assets. Silence. Complete. Total. It took a second for the words to settle. Another second for them to register. And then,
What?
Ethan's voice cut through the room. Sharp. Confused. Margaret didn't pause. To my son, Ethan, I leave the sum of $5,000, along with my personal belongings. The pen slipped from Claire's fingers. Ethan sat back abruptly. That's not right, he said immediately. There's a mistake. There is no mistake, Margaret replied calmly, continuing to hold the document in front of her. That's impossible, he snapped. My father wouldn't do that. Margaret finally looked up. He did. Claire leaned forward, her voice tightening. Was he even competent when he signed this? The implication hung heavily in the air. Margaret didn't flinch.
Yes.
He was fully evaluated. I have documentation confirming his mental clarity at the time of signing. Ethan stood up. This is ridiculous, he said, pacing once behind his chair.
He was sick.
He was under medication. Someone must have influenced him. His eyes shifted toward me, and for the first time, there it was.
Blame.
Accusation. You did this, he said. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't look away. No, I said quietly. I didn't. Margaret closed the document gently. Your father made his decisions independently, she said, and with considerable thought. Claire recovered faster. She straightened, her voice regaining that controlled tone. What about the debts? She asked. The medical expenses? Surely those affect the estate. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. What debts? Ethan froze. Claire blinked. The treatments, she said. The private care. The uncovered costs. Margaret's expression didn't change. Daniel had comprehensive insurance. His out-of-pocket expenses were minimal. Silence again. But this time, it was different. Heavier. Because now the truth wasn't just surprising. It was exposing something. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not what we were told. Margaret didn't respond to that. Instead, she reached for another page. There is an additional clause you should be aware of. Ethan stopped pacing. What clause? Margaret looked directly at him. If you attempt to contest the will, you forfeit your inheritance entirely. The words landed like a strike. Ethan stared at her. He can't do that. He already did. Claire leaned closer to him, whispering something urgently, but he didn't respond. He just stood there.
Processing.
Failing to process. There is also a letter, Margaret added. Ethan looked up sharply. What letter? One your father wrote specifically for you. A pause. Would you like me to read it? Claire shook her head slightly, but Ethan didn't stop her. Yes, he said. His voice was quieter now. Margaret opened a separate envelope. The room felt smaller, tighter. As she unfolded the page, she began to read. Ethan, if you're hearing this, it means you've learned about my final decisions. Her voice remained steady, measured, but the words carried weight far beyond the room. I hope you take a moment to understand why I made them. Ethan didn't move. For years, your mother has been the foundation of this family. Strong, patient, and selfless in ways you may never fully understand. I felt my throat tighten, but in my final months, I saw something that deeply troubled me. Margaret paused briefly, then continued. I saw you treat her as if she were incapable, as if her voice didn't matter, as if her role in our lives had diminished. Ethan's eyes lowered slightly. You spoke over her. You excluded her. You made decisions that were not yours to make. Claire shifted uncomfortably. The moment you suggested removing her security for your own convenience, I knew something had to change. The room was silent. No one moved. No one interrupted. Being a son is not about control.
It is about respect.
And you forgot that. Margaret finished reading, folded the paper, and set it down. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sank slowly back into his chair. Claire looked at him, then at me, then away again. This is insane, she said finally, her voice tight. She can't manage all of this. I looked at her, and this time, I didn't feel small. I've managed more than you think, I said. Ethan looked up at me, really looked, for the first time in a long time. You're really going through with this? He asked. With what? With this, he gestured vaguely. Acting like you can handle everything. I held his gaze. I'm not acting. A pause. This is my life. Claire stood abruptly.
We're leaving, she said.
But Ethan didn't move immediately. He just sat there, caught between anger and something else. Something quieter. Something unfamiliar. Then finally he stood. Without another word, they walked out. The door closed behind them, and the room fell silent again. Margaret looked at me. Well, she asked gently. I took a slow breath, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not happiness, something stronger.
Clarity.
I think, I said slowly, this is where everything begins. Margaret smiled slightly. I believe you're right. I stood up, not hesitantly, not uncertainly, but firmly, because for the first time, I wasn't being pushed out of my life. I was stepping into it. 3 months passed. Not slowly, not quickly, just steadily. Time no longer felt like something I had to survive. It became something I moved through, day by day, choice by choice. The house, which once felt unbearably empty, started to feel different. Not full again, not in the way it had been with Daniel, but no longer hollow. It felt like mine. The first few days after the will reading were quiet. Almost too quiet. No calls from Ethan.
No sudden visits.
No checking in. At first, I kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting another argument, another attempt to take control, another explanation that wasn't really an explanation. But nothing came. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I started to hear myself again. Not the version of me that had been interrupted, corrected, or dismissed, but my own thoughts, uninterrupted. My own decisions unchallenged. It was unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable. I had spent so many years adjusting, accommodating, stepping back when someone else stepped forward, that standing still in my own space felt strange. But not wrong. Never wrong. The first decision I made on my own was a small one. I hired someone to take care of the yard. It sounds simple, almost insignificant, but it wasn't. For years, things like that had always been discussed, reviewed, decided together, or later decided for me. This time, I picked up the phone, asked questions, compared options, and chose.
Just like that. No hesitación. No permission.
And when the work was done, when I stood by the window watching the freshly trimmed grass and the clean edges of the garden, I didn't feel incapable. I felt capable. From there, things began to shift more naturally. I arranged for regular cleaning. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I didn't have to do everything anymore. I called a handyman to fix small things around the house that had been bothering me for months. I organized the finances with Margaret's help, and for the first time, I understood exactly what I had, what I needed, and what I could do. There was no confusion. No fear. Just clarity. And slowly, I started to fill my time differently. Not with obligation, but with intention. I joined a small book club at the local library. The first time I went, I almost turned around at the door. Old habits. That quiet voice that says you don't quite belong. But I stayed. I listened. And then I spoke. And no one interrupted me. No one corrected me. They just listened. I forgot how powerful that could feel. A few weeks later, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I had never painted before. I wasn't particularly good at it either. My first attempt looked more like a blur of colors than anything meaningful. But I didn't stop, because it wasn't about being good. It was about doing something that was mine. Something no one had chosen for me. The house began to change too, but not in the way people might expect. I didn't erase Daniel's presence. I didn't pack everything away or try to pretend he had never been there. His chair was still in the same place. His books were still on the shelf. The garden he planted still bloomed. But I added things. New colors. New routines. New life alongside the memories. Not replacing. Continuing. One morning, as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't just getting through the days anymore. I was living them. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Ethan. For a moment, my chest tightened, not with fear, but with something closer to uncertainty. I hadn't heard his voice since the reading. I didn't know what to expect. I answered. Hello. There was a pause. Then, Mom. His voice sounded different. Quieter. Less certain. Another pause. I've been thinking, he said. I waited, not rushing him, not filling the silence. About what Dad wrote, he continued. About everything. I leaned slightly against the counter. I should have listened to you, he said. A long time ago. The words landed softly. Not dramatic. Not forced. Just honest. I didn't realize what I was doing, he added. Or maybe I did, and just didn't want to admit it. I closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't the conversation I had imagined. It was quieter, more real. I'm sorry, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not just because he said them, but because of how he said them. Without defensiveness, without expectation, just apology. I know, I replied gently. He let out a slow breath. Claire and I, he hesitated. We separated. I wasn't surprised. Not really. She couldn't let it go, he said. The money, the will. She kept saying it wasn't fair, that something had to be done. And you? I asked. I started realizing she wasn't wrong about one thing, he said. Something did have to be done. A pause. Just not what she meant. I felt a small shift inside me. Can I come see you? He asked. Not to talk about any of that. Just to talk. I looked around the kitchen. At the sunlight. At the quiet. At the life I had rebuilt piece by piece. Yes, I said. You can come. That afternoon, he arrived alone. No confidence. No control. Just him. He stood in the doorway for a second before stepping inside, as if unsure whether he still belonged there. You do, I said quietly. He nodded. We sat in the living room, his father's chair across from mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then slowly, the conversation began. Not about money, not about the will, about everything else, about the past, about things we had both ignored, about the way roles had shifted without either of us truly noticing. I think I started seeing you as someone who needed managing, he admitted at one point, instead of someone who had always managed everything. I smiled faintly. That happens more often than you think. I forgot who you were, he said. No, I rappelé gently. You just stopped paying attention. He nodded. That's worse. We talked for hours. Really talked. Not like before. Not surface level. Not controlled.
Honest. Messy. Real.
When evening came, we cooked dinner together. Something simple. Something familiar. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like we were playing roles. We were just people. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking out the window, not thinking, just feeling. 6 months after Daniel's death, I no longer felt like I had been left behind. I felt like I had been set free, not from him, but by him.
He had seen me.
Truly seen me. And in the end, he had given me something more valuable than security. He had given me back to myself. The woman I had been. The woman I had forgotten. The woman I had become again.
And now,
I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't asking for space. I wasn't shrinking to make others comfortable. I was living. Fully. Honestly. Independently. As I stepped outside into the garden that evening, the sky painted in soft shades of gold and pink, I felt something warm settle over me. Not grief. Not loneliness. Something quieter. Stronger.
peace.
I'm okay, I whispered into the air. And for the first time, I truly meant it.